views and opinions expressed in this program are those of the participants and do not necessarily reflect the views of BronxNet or the program underwriters.
Good evening and welcome to the Bronx Buzz. This is BronxNet's program where we talk to reporters and editors and writers and journalists and sometimes filmmakers and photographers, authors and other people who create stuff and put something out in the Bronx. And I said about authors deliberately because our second segment is going to involve a fascinating book that has come across our presence in the borough of the Bronx. But we're going to start off with an old-time friend of ours, David Brand, who's a senior reporter at City Limits. So, David, nice to see you again.
Good to see you. Thanks for having me back.
And you will thank your 2-year-old son for the beautiful background. I appreciate that.
I have to. Yeah, this is the best background I've had so far, I think.
There you go. Listen, I told you before the show, and I'm going to lead off the segment with it. When I read your article, and the article is called "The New York City Council Considers a Bill to Probe Why Homeless Are Denied Supportive Housing," I have to tell you, I thought it was among the craziest things I had ever heard. It seems to me, if we're going to provide some support, we should start with the people who need it most. Mm-hmm. And from your article, it seems clear to me that the people who need it most are not getting it and maybe lowest on the totem pole, and I just can't imagine it. So why don't you maybe start from the beginning and talk about the notion of supportive housing for homeless people and why it's not getting to the people who are most needy for it.
Supportive housing is a really important resource in New York City. We're dealing with a historic homelessness crisis. There were just 46,000 people staying in homeless shelters run by the Department of Homeless Services just this week, each night this week. And so we need housing solutions. More and more often, supportive housing becomes kind of a reference for leaders, for policymakers, and it is very important. There's about 35,000 units of supportive housing, mostly for people who have experienced homelessness. But vacancies are kind of few and far between because many of the units are already occupied. And so people who are living in homeless shelters or on the streets, but it's very hard to get into supportive housing if you're living on the streets, mostly shelters, are kind of competing with one another for a limited amount of resources. It's a big time supply problem. There's also a problem that advocates point out that providers will choose the people who need the fewest services.
Because it's easier for them to deliver it.
Yeah, exactly. And it's not, there's a lot of...
does not compute here. I'm trying to put the dots together. It doesn't work.
And that's the purpose of this bill, because as more and more people cite supportive housing as like the main solution for ending homelessness in New York City, then going to need to build a lot more of it, but also there's nuance here. Not everybody needs it. People who need it aren't getting it. People who have severe mental illness need even higher level of support, but those don't exist. So
let's define supportive housing. Now, you mentioned something that I was going to bring up. If you take a step back and look at the whole system, look at the people sleeping on the subways, and now there's stories coming out saying that, again, still, they would rather not be in shelters. Incredibly, it's better for them to be sleeping on a subway bench, which is you can't even imagine. But the one thing that you need to deal with whatever their issues are, whether they be, let's say, DV issues or mental health issues or even substance abuse issues, we need support to help them. And I think logic and everybody would agree with that. And so why don't you define for us, before we talk into what's not happening, the supportive housing that's there and why is it so valuable to these people who really may need it?
Sure. So there are basically two types of supportive housing, and this is kind of simplifying things, but there's site-specific supportive housing, which is permanent housing, permanent apartments. People sign leases, they pay rent, usually with the help of a subsidy like Section 8. Pretty much an entire building is devoted to this permanent housing with on-site social service support. mental health support, case management, counseling, recreation. And then there's something called scattered site supportive housing. And these are apartments in the community that are rented out by nonprofit providers and then subleased to tenants who have experienced homelessness. And it's generally people with mental illness. There's also supportive housing for families, for survivors of domestic violence, for people with HIV/AIDS. But those are the two types: the site-specific and the scattered site supportive housing.
I'm going to read right from your piece as it stands. Just about listen to this number: 1 in 5 supporting housing applicants get an apartment,
Mhm.
according to the Supporting Housing Network of New York and the Coalition for the Homeless. It just seems kind of crazy. Is this the kind of thing that you throw money at, and that's why it has to go to legislation to legislate that has to be part of, let's say, the city budget? Is that where we're at? That it's just a matter of let's do it, or is, of course, one of the problems location problems and availability problems?
Yeah, I mean the main problem I think you'd hear from advocates for most advocates of the rights to homeless, or from supportive housing providers, or from lawmakers, is that you need more money to fund more development of supportive housing, and that would address the supply issue. Because, as you said, only 1 in 5 applicants is getting a placement, and that's ultimately a supply problem. But as we mentioned earlier, that it does lead to what they call screening or creaming, where they will choose a person who is they find to be the best fit for
Or
that site.
or better off, so that they don't have to provide a more stringent program of services. It reminds me of the initial dialogue about charter schools,
Hmm.
in that charter schools, they alleged, were cherry picking who they
Mhm.
wanted to be in the school, because it would make them look better. And they were certainly in the beginning, maybe less so now, but they were fighting for their lives, so to speak, and their establishment of their programs. To me, and this, it comes up just about everywhere, in every Bronx neighborhood where there's an attempt to cite some sort of housing, whether supportive or not. The nature of the organizations that run them always seems to come into question.
Hmm.
And maybe I'm making a judgment that I ought not to make, but you're suggesting it by saying, they're doing a good job and an important job, but maybe not the whole job. Am I being unfair?
No, I don't think you're being unfair. I mean, I think there's a lot of nuance to it. I think people who get into this line of work, uh, social workers, case managers in particular, they're not getting paid well. They're doing really hard
Ah,
work. They are basically making, a career decision based on ideological reasons. Like, they
right. That
want to help
they
people,
wanted to
and
help the
yeah.
problem. Yeah.
And so on an individual basis, though, sometimes that does lead to this kind of creaming or screening. And I
Right.
don't think it's some like large uh, uh, deliberate process of saying, well, we want this person because they're easy. But I think on a case by case basis, that does end up happening. And so, and there's going to definitely be like organizations that are bad actors and others that are like sterling examples of social service.
Social service abuse. There was that guy, and I'm sorry I didn't remember his name, who had skimmed a lot of money off the top for vacations and everything else, and that gives the whole. Maybe that's what got me thinking the
Well,
worst,
yeah,
so to
yeah. You
speak.
see that was probably the CEO of the shelter provider,
That's
Core
correct.
Services, and so
That is correct.
supportive housing will differentiate it from shelters. Shelters temporary. Supportive housing, this is permanent housing with supports on site or visiting. So maybe that would lead to less corruption in that regard.
Yeah.
But I think that's why we need reporting. I think that's what advocates
Ah,
would say. Like, that's why we need
that's why we need
this
David
bill.
Brand.
Well, or reporting by journalists, but
Oh,
I
I
mean
see.
more reporting by the city to say, like, this is why someone was
I see.
denied, and you could find patterns based on that reporting.
Right.
Like, they keep saying this person needs a higher level of care, higher level of care. Well, like, is there a higher level of care available? And if there's not, how could the city or the state direct more funding to create that
Right.
higher level of care so that
And
people aren't being screened out like that?
And this bill in the city council would potentially insist that there are certain requirements for the providers.
Yeah, it would insist that the Department of Homeless Services and the Human Resources Administration like compile and publish annual reports on specifically why people were denied placement in supportive housing, how many people are awaiting placement, and that kind of transparency and specificity would would highlight problems
Mhm.
like this creaming, screening,
Right.
cherry picking, but also would you could find gaps in the types of housing that's available, in in the referrals that uh, Department of Homeless Services is making to these nonprofit providers. If DHS thinks this person's a good fit, the provider says, "Well, actually, they're not a good fit for us. This is why." You can look at that across an entire system and determine what resources are really needed.
Now, as I understand it, this is a bill that council members, at least for this session, we're going to have a new city council on January 1st, are behind, but it has not come to a vote. And the Speaker, Corey Johnson, has not put it to a vote. Wonder if he's waiting for it to just pass to January and let somebody else handle
Yeah.
it. Now, just to let people know, we're recording this on Monday, the 6th. And they are going to have a stated meeting with some voting on Thursday. I don't know if this is on the docket and if this will come up or not, but maybe you know better than I do, Dave.
I think this one's not going to make it into
Yeah.
into this upcoming stated meeting, which then there's one more left after that. So that's going to be an opportunity for this bill and many other pieces of legislation
that are still out there.
Yeah.
David, you want to give us a sneak preview as what you're thinking about or working on as we get toward the end of the year, or do we not have anything yet? I'm just
Yeah, sure thing.
I'm
So
fishing here.
I'm working on a story. Today's Monday. This will be coming out Tuesday. I think it's the
Right.
5-year anniversary of two little girls who were staying in a cluster site shelter unit in a building in Hunts Point were killed by a radiator explosion. And so
Oh my goodness.
revisiting what's going on at that building.
Oh boy.
The tenants in that building 5 years later are still fighting the landlord for safer conditions, for functioning elevator, for a heating system that they're
Now,
not
is
scared
this
of
this
exploiting.
is a shelter, you said?
This is it's an apartment building, but the
Got it.
city had previously rented out apartments in that building for use as they called it cluster site shelter
Right.
units, and so they paid the landlord and said, "Let us use this, and we'll put homeless families in it." The families had no like actual rights to the
Dave,
units.
we got to go, but I just want to tell you something that you've already said, and I reinterpreted. This is why we need reporting.
This is why we need
So,
reporting.
and that's why we have David Brand and our great friends at City Limits. Thank you for a great job. There was a part of me that regretted I asked you what you were working on. That's not a fun story,
Always
but
good stuff.
that's why we have great reporters like David Brand, the senior reporter at City Limits. David, happy holidays to you and to your son, who's a budding artist, and we'll bring him on the Bronx Buzz to show off his work one day. So thank you so much.
Thanks
Happy
so much for
holidays.
having me. Happy
Sure.
holidays.
We'll take a short break. When we come back, we're going to talk about a new book about the life of John Lewis that has been put into form that kids will appreciate. And I think it's worthwhile for them, for you, and for me to take a look at it. So don't go away. We'll be right back.
We know that people are dealing with the health crisis, but there's also a lot of food insecurity.
We're giving out healthy food options, and that's what's key here.
If you're a senior, you have a disability, they'll actually deliver meals to you.
The residents are anxious, they're worried, they're scared, they want to be tested.
When things were happening in our community and we couldn't get the help.
There's almost a presumption of criminality that attaches to your skin color.
The site will prioritize those who are at highest risk in the population.
If you feel symptoms and you'd like to visit one of these COVID-19 testing sites here in the Bronx, you may call the State Health Department's hotline.
Important to note about this site is no reservations are needed. This is a walk-in clinic.
A lot of us are out of work and looking for something to do.
We have the machinery and the skills to make large scales of these masks and gowns.
Take care of your people. It's going to go way further than we actually can understand.
Right now, employees like myself are just adjusting to the new reality.
Reporting from Bronxnet, this is Tran.
Okay, back with you on the Bronx Buzz. Thanks to David Brand for that incredible reporting, and we need a heck of a lot more of it. And anytime he does it, we'll bring him back on the Bronx Buzz. Right now, I want to turn to a friend of mine. He's actually a neighbor of mine, lives in my neighborhood. My buddy Alex Simmions, who by all rights is a brilliant comic book writer, but a comic book fan and a comic book promoter. All of the above, and he's
all that good stuff, right?
All that good stuff, but really made an industry out of giving young people a chance to see themselves in a format that they can appreciate and they can get from. And recently emceed a panel discussion about a book called Run Book One, which he's got the book right there,
yes.
Which is based on the life of the late Congressman John Lewis. And so there's the book. Why don't you give us the whole background? You were telling me about it beforehand, that this is actually a sequel by John Lewis, and then we'll bring up why you were chosen to be the moderator of the panel.
The short story, because it's a very huge one, but the short version of this story is that Congressman John Lewis was right there in ground zero, if you want to call it that, during the civil rights movement in the 60s, right there with Martin Luther King and the various organizations that developed to move forward to fight for Black civil rights, in particular in the South. And he had a remarkable life, in terms of highs and lows. Remarkable life, was very much a part of the movement. And just a few years ago, was convinced by one of the young men who is an aide for him as a congressman, Aiden Andrews, said, Congressman, you've got to write this. You've got to write about your life. You've got to write about what happened. Not just because it's about the civil rights movement, but it's about life. It's about how people, even people with theoretically common ground, can clash as well as come together. And to show, this is a human condition. It's a human story.
And I have to interject, what a contemporary story with two factions of Democrats who can't get together. And certainly
that's a whole nother smoke.
But that is part of what you're talking about, that we're on the same page. We are working toward the same thing, but we can't come to agreement.
Yeah, because I've got mine, you got yours, and I don't see any way for them to blend the mix or meet.
Fascinating.
So the congressman did, and that was March, the graphic novel March, which was in 3 parts, and of course was an award winner, and moved and kicked open a number of doors, and became a great way to introduce young people to the civil rights movement, because it's this type of thing of where we have a major event in social history, and then all you need is a few TV commercials and a couple of movies, and boom, we forgot about it again.
That's right. I saw that on TV. Yeah, that was yesterday.
Yeah, right. That was like 20 minutes ago, right? So it was a thing of bringing that back, and again, from that level of these were the players involved, and this is what it looked like, and these are the conflicts that were going, not just black and white, but black to black, white to white, and so forth. And after finishing that, which only took you to a certain point in the civil rights movement, that's when, again, as I understand it from the panel, Aiden Andrews said to the congressman, the rest of the story is just as poignant, just as important. And so they talked, and eventually they wrote Run, but it's in two books. So the first book is out.
Is the one that's out now.
That's the one that's out now. Whether or not the second one or how it's going to come out, that's still in question right now, as I understand it. I'm not an authority on it. This is what I got from the panel.
Sure. Let's talk about the nature of the book. And Rebecca has some great photos of the pages. This is, on some basic level, a comic book. I mean, you called it a
graphic novel.
A graphic novel. Yeah. But this is how young people can really absorb.
It's sequential art. It's a comic book. It's a graphic novel. It's a story with visual aid. It's whatever way you want to look at it in terms of a story about people. It's not superheroes now. It's people living in ordinary people living in an extraordinary times and living an extraordinary life. In often at times a very dangerous and traumatic life. And this is what happened really in terms of how the movement began to shift and sort of fracture. And it became, well, yeah, we're all about wanting equal rights for Black people, but I want it this way, you want it that way, and we're seeing it a third way. And it just began to splinter. And what that did in terms of the congressman's point of view, what that did, how that affected him, how that affected the movement, how that affected people who were not Black, but wanted to be a part of the movement to support it, and yet were being either ostracized or trying to find their own way, or walking away and going, okay, forget it.
You know,
So
there's something that you said in there that I'm going to differ with. You said who are not superheroes, but maybe there are some real life superheroes, a lot different than the beautiful, wonderful, dramatic characters you've created, but a different way of looking at superheroes.
Well,
is that fair? That's fair.
Well, as a wordsmith, which is what I am, I tend to play this game. I think that people are capable of being heroes. I think the word hero carries weight in and of itself. Superheroes, yeah, that's a compliment to the average person, but it basically refers to people with powers and capes. And so I tend to think of, people who do heroic things or who are heroes, they don't need to be super. They just went in the direction of the danger rather than running from it.
Well, using the word run, I'm sorry, Alex, that's me. You know me a long time. That's
come on, so many years that we can't even count them anymore.
So, we're really not going to do that. Yeah. What is interesting to me is, basically it's first you walk, then you run. And this is a way of communicating with young people. Talk to me a little bit, outside of this book, but in general, what you have found, and you have traveled the world literally using comic books to communicate ideas. Why is this effective for young people?
Well, I'm going to try and answer your question and also tap the book experience, or at least the panel experience one. For one, young people in my travels, and that literally is traveling the world, young people are young people, period. We all come into this world with the same basic material and then try and figure out who we are and where we fit in. And I've run into young people in the United States, Black, white, Asian, whatever, Europe, Africa, and
the Soviet Union.
Soviet Union. They have the same basic aspirations to try and figure out, how do I fit in? How do I make my place? And some of them have such tremendous stories, whether they're happy stories or traumatic stories. They have such tremendous stories and things they're trying to work out. And graphic novels or comic books are ways for them not only to read about others who might be going through a similar thing or like them, or read about stories that take them away from the thing that's weighing down on them. But also because of, a lot of the artists I work with, the things that I'm doing as well, and people in other places, other countries are doing, it's a wonderful methodology, therapeutic methodology for young people to express their stories and express and tell the kind of stories and things that they're encountering and they're dealing with and they're trying to figure out. So that's been very impressive to me and very impactful to me. And I think
why a story like this needs to be told in that way.
Right.
I'm sure I've related this to you a number of times, that when I was younger and had a pile of comic books, my parents, who were very traditional educators, were concerned that we were not getting reading.
We're reading real books, right?
Real books, but they were counseled to back off because it helps the child illustrate and picture in their mind what they're reading. And if maybe they're not that strong, reading words, but when the words are put with the pictures,
that's right.
It
right.
works.
But one other thing too, in the panel, and again I interviewed Aidan Andrew, Nate Powell, who's one of the illustrators, and Elle Fury, who's the other illustrator of the book Run. And I asked them a question about what was it like, because they're all of them are white. All three of them are Caucasian and were raised in the South. And I said, what was it like working on this story and even on March, which is a story about, in effect, the Black movement and predominantly, it's a Black man's story about what he did during that time. What was it like for you doing this? And they all said, literally, they each told a story about the awakening that they had to some aspect of their upbringing and their own view and their parents' view of life around them by reading, and I'm sorry, by working on this book, by developing this book, by creating the art, and of course, then having the book in their hands, looking at it and reading it and recognizing, oh my goodness, I didn't realize that they thought this way, or so-and-so saw it this way, or that we were privileged in such and such a way. So, once again, the books, the graphic novels, not only tell a tale that someone can consume, but they also enlighten the creators.
They bring it to life. In some ways, I relate it to the women's movement, that we're not going to have a fully liberated women's movement until the men fully understand it. And it would be like men writing a book about, a women's movement, et cetera, and getting an education along with it. It's really it's a fantastic concept. I'm wondering now, John Lewis viewed it like this. I mean, this is what his vision was.
This was his point of view.
Wow.
And he worked very hard to be, I feel, very honest about, in telling this tale. Yes, it's from his experiential point of view, but he also was respectful of those who were counter to where his head was or his view was. He tried to present it in a way that was an honest, authentic telling of the tale, a respectful telling of the tale.
Alex, we are just about out of time. Take about 30 seconds. What are you working on? Some for yourself? You're drawing.
Myself,
you're
I'm
writing?
working on my own project, which is another graphic novel called Blackjack, which is about a black soldier of fortune in the 1930s, because history does matter.
And you will make sure to let us know when it comes out, and you will be here again. And maybe I'll run into you in the grocery store.
Of course
you never know. So listen, happy holidays, my longtime friend, and best to your family and the kids and everything else. And that's it for the Bronx Buzz for this evening. Thanks again to David Brandt, Alex Simmions, to John Lewis for inspiring all of us. And what a good way to think about our holiday season, peaceful, with equality, and everybody being family, one family. All right, so happy holidays to everybody. Good night.